I've been talking about the general theories of the mind-body relation, and that's the overall mind-body problem. Thinking about the relation between mental properties, or mental substances, and physical properties, physical substances, and how are they connected. But the specific topic for the course is consciousness, and pretty much everybody agrees that consciousness is the real heart of the mind body problem as it is now. So, we figured out ways in which we can think about mathematics and decision making and so forth in terms of specifically computers doing those similar sorts of operations. And so it seems like we can account for a lot of what the mind does in physical terms, except consciousness. So, consciousness is kind of the sticking point at this point in the mind body problem. And so that's what we're going to focus on in this class. So we need a definition. What is consciousness? What is the phenomenon that we're going to be focusing on to try to explain? And the problem is that there really isn't a good definition for consciousness, for what it is that we're trying to get at. People use the word consciousness in a lot of different ways, and you can kind of pay attention to how that works. But specifically pay attention to how we're talking about consciousness in this class, because you can get led astray if you don't really carefully pay attention to what it is we're talking about as we go through. And periodically, I'll come back to this question. So, what is consciousness? And what consciousness is for the purposes of this class is phenomenal consciousness. And as I said, there's not a really good definition for it. The way in which we'll be talking about it is what it's like to have an experience. So, phenomenal consciousness is what it's like to have an experience, what it's like to be you and be having the experience that you're having right now. So you're seeing things, you're hearing things, you're feeling things. These are all varieties of phenomenal consciousness. As I mentioned before, in dreamless sleep, it looks like you're not conscious. You're not having your feelings. You're not seeing anything because you're not dreaming. You're not hearing anything. You are not conscious. So, this is sort of a basic kind of contrast to try to get at what phenomenal consciousness is. Your journal entries are going to also uh, try to get you to be reflective on your experience and try to get a better sense of what phenomenal consciousness is, what it's like to be you in having an experience. So, that's why those journal entries are really, really important. Um, that's often contrasted with how things really are, appearance, reality. And so one of the issues then is what is the nature of these seemings? What is the nature of appearances in what it's like? Is the nature of it to be non-physical? Is that what it is to be an appearance? Or is there some other way to talk about what phenomenal consciousness is that makes sense? And Ned Block, who articulated this idea of phenomenal consciousness, distinguished it particularly from what he talks about as access consciousness. And he says access consciousness is the availability for use in reasoning, speech, and action. So when you're conscious, then that means you have the ability to report on what you're experiencing. So right now, one access conscious aspect of my phenomenal consciousness is that that I'm hearing my voice and I'm seeing the screen in front of me as I'm speaking. So those are things that I can report about. And one of the ways to articulate what is different about access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, particularly one of the ways Block talks about it, is that phenomenal consciousness outruns access consciousness. There's more phenomenal consciousness than we can report about, than is accessible in this way. And that's why phenomenal consciousness cannot be explained simply in terms of the sorts of things that we can report about. So it seems like if you look around the room right now, and reflect on what it's like for you to be having that experience, you're not going to be able to describe all of the things that you're experiencing phenomenally. At least this is what Ned Block claims. This is going to be one of the issues, is what the relationship is between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. But whatever the relationship is, what's critical is that we're trying to explain phenomenal consciousness. That's the target of explanation that we have in this course. That's what we're going to be trying to bridge the gap and explain what that is. Maybe what that is a separate kind of property or a separate kind of substance. Maybe what that is a different way of being something that's actually physical. Maybe it's actually a brain process, and it's just hard to appreciate why it's a brain process. So that's going to be the issue. What is phenomenal consciousness, and how do we explain it? As I said, the problem for this semester is the explanatory gap, explaining how physical processes and mental processes are related. Are they one or are they two? The explanatory gap. Another way to talk about the explanatory gap is as the hard problem. And the hard problem is a way of talking about the explanatory gap that was coined by David Chalmers. And he said, well, there are these easy problems of the mind. And he talked about the ability to discriminate, categorize, and react to stimuli, report mental states, focus, attention, control behavior. These are various different kinds of mental processes that he thought, are easy in the sense that we, pretty much could no, we pretty much have an idea about how we can explain those in terms of brain processes. We can look at the way neurons interact, and we can look at the way in which people relate to their environment, and we can figure out how these different kinds of problems can be solved. In contrast to the easy problems, Chalmers said there is the hard problem. And the hard problem is why physical processes give rise to subjective experience, why they don't just go on in the dark. So the hard problem is the problem of consciousness. Why do we have consciousness at all? And this is especially difficult given the progress that neuroscientists and psychologists are making on the easy problems. It seems like they're explaining more and more and more of our ability to operate in the world without ever explaining consciousness. And it seems like maybe consciousness is not necessary for most of the things that we think are important to how we go about in the world. And we'll talk about unconscious processes and some of the ways that we operate unconsciously quite successfully, and even perhaps better than we would if we had consciousness involved. So we have this question about why is there consciousness? What work is consciousness doing? And that's what's known as the hard problem. Descartes focused on the mind and found he could imagine a mind without a body, and concluded they must be essentially different. So the question is, how does the hard problem get us to dualism? Chalmers is a dualist. He introduces the hard problem. How does that get you to dualism? Chalmers, on the other hand, focuses on the body and various psychological explanations of the functions, all the easy problems, and he found that he can imagine that there is not a mind, that all of these kinds of processes could go on, as he says, in the dark. And, he calls this thought experiment that he does the zombie thought experiment, and we'll talk more about that later. So imagining the body without the mind is the way in which Chalmers thought we could get to dualism. Generally, there are three responses to the mind body problem. The first one we can call Mysterians, and they are mostly dualists. For Mysterians, the hard problem is insoluble. You just can't figure out how to solve the hard problem because there are basically two things: dualism. Comprehension of the nature of mind is beyond our conceptual capacity. We just can't figure out what the mind is. It's just a separate kind of stuff, separate kind of property. And so Mysterians are usually dualists of some kind or another. The second response to the hard problem, I call the scientists. Now, scientists can adopt any sort of position to the mind, but I call this response to the hard problem the scientist view because they focus on the easy problems. Let's look at the easy problems, look for correlations with brain processes. So most scientists fall in this camp. of the second response in focusing on, what does the brain do? Looking for correlations when the brain is doing this and consciousness is doing this. How can we look at how they're related? And then, eventually an answer to the hard problem will come in the way that science always operates, is you just keep trying to figure things out, and you get closer and closer, and eventually you figure out how things work. The third position is also mostly materialist, like the scientist position, but they take a more extreme view of the hard problem, and they say that there is no hard problem. The hard problem is imaginary. We just have to look at the easy problem. So, scientists can also be eliminativists and say, look, there's not any extra problem of consciousness that we need to try to solve. We just need to solve the problems of attention, sensation, thoughts, reports. Once we understand how the mind works fully, then we won't have a problem of consciousness. So the big difference between the eliminativist position, and the second scientist position is that the scientists say, yes, there is consciousness. It's puzzling. We really have these feelings and we don't know how they can be explained in terms of brain processes, but eventually we'll get to that explanation. The eliminativists say, no, there isn't something extra that's consciousness. There is just the ability to report, the ability to process sensory information, etc. So we'll be looking at the difference in these three different kinds of positions as we go throughout the semester. So again, as with the general theories of the mind-body relation, idealism, materialism, and dualism, you need to also be thinking about how they respond to the specific issue of the explanatory gap, the hard problem. The dualist goes with the Mysterian position, but materialists can either be in the eliminativist camp or in the scientist camp. And so be thinking about how you think about these different ways of responding to the hard problem.